I am really, really happy to be here. It really feels needed, this kind of event. I think it's really important that we start talking more about failures. And it's interesting because a couple of weeks before I saw Sylvia's post about this event coming up, I was actually talking to a friend of mine about the kind of subject of failure. And we were saying that it feels as though it's become quite fashionable to talk about failure. But a lot of what we see and what we were kind of talking about is what we describe as sort of polished failure. So it's this thing where people talk about failing, but often what they're actually talking about is a success dressed up in a failure disguise. So they're kind of being quite self-deprecating, and they're talking about something that went a little bit wrong, but then, you know, they triumphed and they got past it and everything was great in the end. And I think what we don't see so much of is people talking about real failure where things go badly wrong. And I think it's really, really important that we normalize failure and we use it to learn lessons, and that we do make it okay to fail in our workplaces, because ultimately I think failure is what helps us to learn. But at the same time, it does feel really important to me that we tell the truth about it. And I think sometimes we're so keen to turn everything into a success story in the end that we can sometimes skip over the fact that failure often means things getting broken, and that sometimes those things are really hard to repair. So things like people's trust or goodwill or people's well-being even. So although I definitely support the move to talk more about failure and to try and normalize failure, I think it's really important that we do acknowledge the messy truth of it and talk about the very serious collateral damage that can happen along the way, and that we don't just skip straight ahead to the growth that eventually came out of it. So that's what I'm going to try and do today. I've tried to be as kind of honest and as real as I can, and I hope that I'll still continue to get hired for design systems consultancy after this. So wish me luck. So for those of you who have no idea who I am, as Sylvia said, I'm a UK-based consultant, and I specialise in two main areas. So the first one is content design, and the second one is design systems. And given the nature of today's meetup, for obvious reasons, I'm going to be talking about design systems today. So over the past kind of 6 or 7 years or so, I've worked on design systems at the UK Government Digital Service, so for gov.uk, also for Babylon Health, for BT, which also includes EE and PlusNet. And right now I'm working for Springer Nature, who are a big scientific research publishing organisation, which some of you might know. And I've also consulted on a kind of much shorter term basis with other teams too. And I have worn different hats during this time. So I've worked on some teams as a content designer or a tech writer focusing on documentation. And I've worked and I'm working now as a design systems manager, so leading the work of a design system team. And just to give you a little bit of forewarning, I am going to swear a tiny little bit, especially at the beginning of this talk. So if you have any children or people of a kind of non-sweary disposition in your vicinity, and you don't want them to hear me dropping an F-bomb, then now is your opportunity to move them or put headphones in or put headphones on them. Okay, so because of the directive for this gathering, I'm going to talk about a fuck up that I made, and a pretty big one. We'll get to that in a moment. But before I talk about that specifically, I'm going to make a little prediction here. So I actually don't know what the other speakers are going to talk about in a lot of detail right now, but I'm going to guess that a common thread that ties all of our failures together is that we all tried, or in one way or another, we all tried to do something that didn't work in the context that we were working in at the time. And I'm making that bet because it's a real theme that I'm seeing in design systems work at the moment. So I think that this space has reached a level of maturity that we are now bombarded with so many articles and statements and talks and case studies and things about how we have to approach this work, that it's really easy to find ourselves going after this vision of a perfect design system and really losing sight of our context and what that actually requires from us. And then what happens is that vision that we have and that we're chasing after becomes a kind of square peg for a round hole. And it sometimes takes us a while to realize that it really doesn't fit with where we are. And that was definitely my mistake. That was my misstep, which I'm going to talk to you in this story about how I fucked up in establishing a contribution practice for my very first consultancy client. And I know that this isn't a competition to work out which of us fucked up the hardest, but just in case you do want to judge it as a competition, I'm just going to throw in there that not only did I fuck up contribution quite epically, but I also fucked up my face in the process. And I wish I was joking about this, but actually in the process of spectacularly tanking our contribution practice and also a whole lot of goodwill from my client's team, I burnt myself out so badly that I got shingles in my head, followed by a neurological condition called Ramsay-Hunt syndrome, which was actually recently made famous by Justin Bieber, who has now got it and is hopefully recovering. So this is me with it before it was famous. The left side of my face and neck got totally paralyzed. So I couldn't really speak, eat, or just do basic things like close both of my eyes to go to sleep at night. So this is a picture of me a few weeks into recovery. Unsurprisingly, I didn't take too many photos in the very early days of it, certainly none that I really want to share. And I'm really, really lucky that I did recover. And now I can use this as a tale of caution to remind you that design systems, although obviously very, very important to all of us here, are absolutely never worth sacrificing your physical and mental health for. They are just design systems. So learn from my lesson. So let's talk about how I got here. So thank you for all the hearts I can see going on my screen. So in January 2020, after about 3 years working on the GovUK Design System team at GDS, I decided to start working as a design system consultant. And I was pretty lucky. I got my first gig quite quickly. The client seemed really, really excited to have me. And I think that probably was because the GovUK Design System had by then had quite a lot of hype around it. So I was feeling pretty confident in my ability to really kind of hit the ground running with this first contract. And I felt especially good about it because the client in question wanted me to do pretty much exactly what I had done before. So they were like, you know, that GovUK Design System that you worked on over there at GDS, can you just do that for us here? And in particular, the client was really interested in establishing a contribution practice like the one that we had and had written and talked about for the GovUK Design System, which you can still read about online now. But for those of you who aren't familiar with it, because why would you be if you haven't worked there, the GovUK Design System had what I would describe as the kind of quintessential contribution model. So just to walk you through what it looked like in practice, somebody outside of the design system team would decide to contribute. They would then follow our contribution guidelines and our criteria to develop that contribution to the appropriate standard and with help from our team. That contribution would then be reviewed by a cross-government working group of designers and developers working in different teams. And then the contribution would either be published at that stage or it would go back to the contributor for refinements and some iterations beforehand. And this definitely wasn't a completely hiccup-free process. Sometimes we did hit bumps in the road, but on the whole, this ran pretty smoothly and it followed a fairly conventional approach to design systems contribution. So if you go and read articles about design systems contribution, they will usually describe something like this. So when the client asked me to set up the same contribution model for them, I actually couldn't believe my luck. I thought, well, great, you know, I already know how to do this. I know what this looks like. And I didn't even have to spend time persuading them that this was the right way to go because they were already bought into that idea. But as we're about to see, I couldn't have been more wrong about that. And that's because the context that I was working in by then was really drastically different from the one that I had just come from at GDS. So for starters, the GovUK Design System team at the point I left had a team of about 11 people working on it. But my new client's design system team was just 4 people. So it's just me as design systems manager, a designer, a developer, and a content designer. The GovUK brand and visual language was also well established a long time before the GovUK design system team came along. So I think GovUK was kind of created and set up about 7 years before we created a design system to make that brand easier to apply. But with my new client, they were a fast growing startup and they were still working out their brand and their expression and what that should look like. And since GovUK is a web-only platform, we'd been able to use a very simple technology stack. But my new client needed to support web, iOS, and Android, and all of the complexity that comes with that. So any of you who've worked on multi-platform design systems will know how many layers of complexity that immediately adds to a design system. Also, the culture and the community and the conventions that underpinned the design and front-end development practices in government were mature and solid. But with my new client, we had these small, agile teams of designers and developers who had found their own localized and distinct ways of working in the absence of any kind of organization-wide established practices. And unlike anywhere else that I've worked before or since, designers in government are taught to prototype in code, which meant we had this really tight collaboration and understanding between designers and developers. But at my new client's organisation, which I've learned is much more common, designers and developers were much more siloed with this kind of handover mentality. So the strong entrenched design principles and culture of simplicity at GDS meant that in hindsight, it'd actually been pretty easy to come up with a set of contribution criteria that everyone could understand and work to. But for my new client, their fragmented processes and complexity made it much harder to get any kind of convergence on this kind of thing. So looking at this now, it's probably quite obvious to all of us, and it's obvious to me now that clearly it called for a different treatment, but I didn't know that then. So despite all of this, I charged in there headfirst trying to create GovUK's contribution model. So I worked with my team to create this comprehensive documentation explaining how to contribute and the standards that we expected contributions to meet. We started educating our stakeholders about the benefits of using a federated model to help scale the design system through contribution. And we basically said, come on in, we're open for business, start contributing, come and give us what you've got. But as it turns out, a team of 4 people trying to build the foundations of a new and ambitious design system very quickly become overwhelmed by demand for something like that. So a huge difference between my client team here and the one that I had just come from at GDS was the size and maturity of the team, which meant that we had had a lot more capacity to support and react to incoming contribution at this sort of unpredictable pace. And in the end, this was a difference that we couldn't reconcile. So very quickly, we had people kind of queuing up to contribute and we weren't able to support it. And we ended up having to take this complete U-turn and go from we're open for business to sorry, actually we're closed. We can't take your contributions. We have to shut this down. And that's because I now know that supporting contribution in this ad hoc way, whilst you're still setting up a system's foundations, is kind of like trying to fit the windows into a house that you haven't built yet. And when I look back at this, it seems really obvious to me that the task that we'd set ourselves was just completely unachievable from the start. So we were never really going to be able to support contribution at that point in time in the way that we had promised. But back then I didn't know this, so I didn't communicate this, and I was supposed to be the expert in the room. So actually we did overpromise, and people started to get seriously pissed off with us. They'd been told that this was going to be a community-led design system, but now we were gatekeeping it and we were refusing to take their contributions. And as a result of that, we started to lose trust and goodwill at a really alarming rate. And we saw people turning away from the design system and starting to create their own component libraries as people started to set up their own spaces where they could contribute freely without this bottleneck that we were creating. And so clearly we had to do something differently. So after longer than it probably should have taken us to start course correcting, we took a step back and we started to make some changes. So we abandoned the GovUK design system contribution model and its traditional approach of allowing contributors to bring things to us in this ad hoc way that we promised, and we decided to take a more proactive approach. So instead, we published the roadmap of components that we knew that we needed to deliver in an order that made sense for us to deliver them in. We then set up a weekly forum for contributors to provide input into the components that we were working on, with each week concentrating on a different component. And we used these sessions to have an open conversation to understand requirements and to gather research insights and examples and feedback on our early designs. We then took the outcomes of those sessions and used them to guide the development of our component and to inform that work, with us still kind of driving the work. And then eventually we would publish the components. And this allowed us to start to establish that culture of collaboration and community and contribution without getting derailed by these ad hoc submissions. And over time, these sessions did start to strengthen the relationships and the understanding between designers and developers in our organisation, and to cross-pollinate knowledge between disciplines and also between the people working on our products and the design system team. So we created a practice that actually worked much better for us by letting go of convention in favour of doing the right thing for our context. We ended up taking stock of the existing practices and processes and ways of working that formed our organisation's systems for designing its products, and we worked with those systems to create something that actually fit. And looking back now, I can be really proud of where we ended up with contribution with that client. But when I look back on my time there, I can see that this was just one example of a fundamental flaw in the way that I approached this work back then, which is that over and over again in my first year as a consultant, I failed to put context over convention. So I fell into this really common trap that I see lots of design system teams falling into, and that I myself still do fall into sometimes, even now, which is to approach them as this sort of paint by numbers exercise. So we find ourselves kind of working our way through these checklists of deliverables that some expert without any information about our context has told us that we need to check off before we can have a proper design system. And those of you who went to Clarity Conference will have seen me share this before, but I just wanted to share it again here because it's how I felt back then. And I think it's something that is probably relevant for all of us. So when I think about people working on design systems, I sometimes see us as these salmon swimming upstream and chasing after this vision that we have of an ideal design system. And the current around us represents our unique context and our organisation's needs and the barriers and challenges that we face along the way when we're doing that work. And I think sometimes in pursuit of that vision, we often find ourselves swimming against it. And what often happens when we find ourselves in those situations is that we start to focus on the current and on the friction that we're experiencing. And when we find ourselves making no progress, then we tend to conclude that, well, it must be us, we're doing it wrong, or our context is all wrong, or it's the people around us. And that's certainly what I did in lots of ways, not just in terms of contribution. And that's how I ended up so burnt out and with half my face not working and having to quit work while I slowly and painfully recovered from that. And so if I can leave you with just one thought today, it's this. I think it's really important to say that instead of continuing to swim upstream and just stopping only now and then to notice how exhausted we all are, I think we can give ourselves permission to do something a bit different. So I do think it's okay and actually necessary for us to just swim with the current sometimes, to just embrace the realities of the context that we're working in and to understand what that's calling for. And I think it's okay to look at that design systems vision that our industry dogmatizes and fetishizes sometimes, and to decide for ourselves to go after something else and something that's better for us and for our context today. Thank you very much. And I think we've got time for some questions if people would like to ask me anything about that.
Wow, thank you so much, Amy. Please give a round of applause for Amy in the chat and with some emojis here.
Thank you.
Amazing.
So
Thank you so
cool.
much. Amy, that was
Okay.
amazing, and thank you so much for joining, for sharing your personal story. Someone in the chat said that you're a trendsetter when you mentioned it.
I was.
Yeah, to Justin Bieber. Yeah.
Yeah, maybe not, maybe not in the best way, but yeah, glad to be leading the charge on something anyway.
Yeah, no, but I guess it was super powerful. Some people mentioned in the comments that it's just really great to hear that, so you can be more forgiving to yourself in your journey establishing a design systems. And I guess
Yeah.
it's good to learn from others. A lot of this sounds, well, all too familiar to me in similar ways, setting up a contribution model. And something I always say to students as well is that there's no one size fits all when it comes to design systems. So it's super great to hear about experienced folks like you. And yeah, we learned a lot. Thank you so much.
No problem at all.
Are you up for some questions now?
Yes, yeah, definitely.
There are. So to everybody in the comments, feel free to add your questions. I think we have one question here already. How do you build the right culture around the design systems, around design systems within your team?
Yeah, I think I'm going to give maybe a slightly annoying answer here, but I think to kind of return to the what I've just spoken about, I think it's not really possible for me to give a kind of blanket answer here, because I think it's so important to recognize the culture of your organization and for your design system to be able to work within that. So there's a couple of things that I'd recommend maybe looking at or starting with. One of them is, I don't know if it hasn't been published widely yet. I don't think the Clarity Conference talks have been published broadly yet, but one of the speakers, Ben Callahan, did a whole talk on design systems and culture. And one of the things that he was looking at is how design systems can often find themselves kind of working against the organization's culture, because what we often find is design systems are sort of pitched as this collaborative, open, kind of community-led project. But often our organizations are set up in this quite competitive way. If we're kind of profiting organizations, we're organizations that are looking to make money, and commercial organizations, then quite often individual product teams and things are rewarded, I suppose, and incentivized to focus on their own product and their own context. And then design systems, we're often saying, let's all work together on this thing. Let's make it this kind of whole company owned thing, and something that we all collaborate on. And I don't think that it's that those things can't be brought together and that gap can't be bridged a bit. But I think the really important first thing to do is to recognize if you have some kind of tension or conflict between what you're trying to do with your design system and what your organization as a whole is trying to do, and whether those things are compatible. So I think that's, oh, okay, somebody said that the talk was also on the Smashing Magazine Design System Conference. So definitely check that out. The other thing that I'd recommend looking at is, and it's kind of a similar message, but Lily Dart, who is a design systems person working in the UK, has also done a talk a couple of times on design systems culture. I think it's called The Good, the Bad, and the Culture. And the most recent version that she did was at Converge conference. And again, she sort of spoke about this tension between our company's official culture and the actual reality of the culture that we're working in. So I think, to sort of summarize, I think it's really important to really engage with your culture and your context and figure out what it is that you need to do, because I think we sometimes talk about design systems culture like it's this single one size fits all thing, like you said. But actually what we really need to do is understand our context and what kind of changes we need to make to establish the culture that we need around that work. And I think sort of don't be afraid to, to step away from the things that we're told we have to do. So we're told that design systems have to support contribution to be proper design systems, and but actually your organization might not be set up well to deal with that. And I think if that's the case, then it's fine for design system teams to explore other ways of getting feedback and input without necessarily having this very sort of self-driven contribution model that invites everybody to feed in.
Yeah, no, those are great tips, actually. Couldn't agree more. I guess working together with feature teams, sometimes they have their own challenges. And what I found as well from my experience is that sometimes it's really a kind of a knowledge gap as well. You just simply assume, because the design system is organization wide, that everyone knows about it and everyone knows how to contribute or how to use it. But yeah, I felt like even doing that through communication and education sessions, it can be really beneficial as well. Just bring everyone in the journey. But like you said, no, what works for one team might not work for the next one.
Definitely.
That ties in kind of what you're mentioning there about, I guess, the different interests within the company, ties in with another great question here: how to convince the client to invest in design systems, or even maybe get internal sponsorship within their own organization. How do you explain the return of investment, the ROI?
I think this is a really evergreen question. And I don't know if I have a good answer for it, because again, I think it's so dependent on the kind of individual context that we're working in. I think it's about really highlighting to them. So design systems ultimately are aiming to kind of reduce waste in our processes. They're trying to sort of make us more efficient ultimately. And I have a whole TED talk on why that's not always the best goal. But really, when it comes down to it, like, that's the way that we get funding. It's by hammering that home. So it's an old thing, but something that I refer to a lot when I'm talking to client teams about sort of getting funding and investment. Is I can't remember which article it's from, but it's a Nathan Curtis article where he walks through the example of a button, and it's called, I think it may be called So You Think Buttons Are Easy, and it literally just talks through like all of the different kind of configuration options and variations on a button, which we think of as a really simple component, and all of the design decisions that are encapsulated within a button. So like our color palette, our typography, different themes that we might have to support, different button types, or so, primary, secondary, tertiary, that kind of thing. And he basically sort of scales it up like slowly, showing, how if all these decisions are made for each individual context that exists within an organization, how much money that costs when you kind of times it by the number of people and their salaries and things. And I think he comes up with a figure of like, it's like £1 million for good buttons and stuff. And it's a really simple kind of and slightly reductive way of looking at it, I guess. I think we would all, those of us that work in this space, including Nathan, I think would acknowledge that there's much more complexity there. But it's really powerful. It's a really powerful way to make people who don't understand much about design systems, somebody shared the article, thank you, see how they're kind of wasting money in their processes. The word of caution that I would issue here, though, is I wrote an article which I published on my website, which I'll find and share in the chat in a minute when I've stopped talking, about prioritizing quality over speed in the early stages of a design system. And I think the thing to be really careful of is when you're pitching the work of a design system and asking for funding, is not to kind of overpromise, and to make really clear that this is something that will gradually become more valuable over time, not something that is going to remove duplication of effort from your process altogether, and certainly not from day one. Because I think definitely a kind of trap that I've fallen into and that I've seen teams fall into before is to really hammer that home and make stakeholders almost quite frightened of duplication of effort. And then as soon as they release some funding and hire a team in, they're like, right, nobody must ever do the same thing twice in this organization ever again. Because, we've seen how wasteful it is, and you've convinced us this is a huge problem, and now we just need to eradicate that. And I think that's not realistic either. So I think it's important to try and make the problem clear and try and show how design systems can reduce waste, but also be responsible in that messaging and explain that it's a kind of that hockey stick line of growth where it gradually becomes more valuable over time. And actually the first year or two, it probably is going to cost you more money than it makes you.
Yeah. I can't agree. Yeah, it's something I always see as well. It requires a lot of time investment at the start. Time is money, of course. But it pays off over time. But yeah, I guess when you're, in some cases, it can be really challenging to sell design systems internally. And yeah, whenever you get that sponsorship, you want to show return of investment straight away. But yeah, I think it's a great call out there to say, you know, it's not that easy, or those type of KPIs, maybe, you know, the very harsh ones, like you said, no duplication ever again, might not be realistic. Those are super great call outs. We have so many questions here, so let me just someone asked something in relation to what you had mentioned in your talk. Sorry about that. What are some what are some of your strategies for building a design system as a contractor freelancer versus being internal in the organization?
Could you say that again? Sorry, just
sure. So what are some of your strategies for building design systems as a contractor or freelancer versus being in-house?
So this is something I'm actually thinking a lot about lately, because I definitely see a difference in approach between consultants, especially ones who've always been consultants, and people who've worked in-house for a long time. So just personally, I'm really grateful that I had that 3 years working in-house on a design system, because I think I now tend to approach the work with that in mind. And sometimes, not always, like certainly the more kind of seasoned, experienced consultants, I think, are very responsible about this and recognize that it's an issue. But one thing I think can be a danger with consultants is that you have much more of a sort of short-term view of the design system. So I think it can be easy to fall into the trap of just being very, very tactical and just being like, let's just keep doing stuff and we can iterate and we can improve it and things. Whereas I think when you've worked on a design system for a while and you've been confronted with the consequences of some of those early decisions that you made and realize later down the line, actually that's created a lot of debt for us, or that, you know, is going to be a problem now for us to kind of, because we didn't set it up in the right way. So I think for me, even though I'm a consultant, I always try and wear that hat of somebody in the in-house team. I try to really think about, like, how is this decision that I'm suggesting today going to serve you in 6 months or a year or 2 years? I'm really trying to kind of think ahead to the future and the consequences of those decisions. I think it's really important to listen to the people around you when you're a consultant, because, you know, often I'm sort of walking in for 6 months to, this is the one that I'm working on now has been quite a long engagement. It's been 1.5 years. But normally I'm walking in for sort of 3 to 6 months or something. And I obviously cannot compete with the knowledge and the experience of the client team. So for me, it's really important to try and hear them and understand their concerns and their challenges and their fears and their hopes and the opportunities there, and then really sort of work from that. Whereas I guess a big difference is when you're working in-house on a design system, you're going to be gathering that information sort of firsthand for yourself. And I think as a consultant, I'm much more reliant on the people who have been leading that work and doing that work to kind of arm me with the information I need. And then I'll, you know, when it's appropriate, start to bring in my expertise and my recommendations based on. But I think, yeah, I don't know, I feel like humility is extra important for consultants working in this space, because I see a lot of dogmatism about design systems, and it frustrates me when people who have been kind of career consultants just go, you know, and have never worked on a design system for more than a couple of months, sort of just say, oh, this is the way to do it, and ignore everyone else. You know, I think that's that doesn't work.
Yeah. So as in, if you have a lot of experience, obviously you tried many different strategies and you know what works, and you don't hear anything about the challenges that particular team or client are facing, and you just try to impose your own I guess your own strategies, what worked for your one team in the past. So yeah, it's a great call out to be extra human and to put your little in-house head, be part of the team while you're collaborating with them. Yeah, that's awesome.
Definitely.
I think we have time for one last question, if you don't mind.
Okay. Yeah, sure.
Cool. So someone mentioned here, I'm curious, what happened to the components that the teams needed outside of your team's roadmap? were they created as snowflakes with an idea of reviewing them next year and possibly adding news to the roadmap? I think it was something when, I think this is in relation to when you're talking about this strategy that you created for, you know, applying the roadmap and then deciding what comes in the roadmap and what doesn't.
Yeah, I'm not sure that we ever solved that perfectly. I think, as I kind of mentioned in the talk, what happened was people started creating their own local component libraries just to kind of capture that stuff. And I think slightly out of frustration with us, which is fair enough. We're actually wrangling with that same challenge with the design system team that I'm working with right now, and thinking about how we can provide a space for people to share, to try and sort of reduce some of that unnecessary duplicated work. If two people are creating the same thing at the same time, then it makes sense for them to talk. But I'm also like, I try and push on that a little bit with people, because I think, as I sort of mentioned, and as I said in that article that I've just posted a link to in the chat, I think because we are so emphatic about the cost that comes with duplication of effort when we're making the business case for a design system, we can often inadvertently create this real sense of urgency around that problem, and we kind of create this idea that it's you know, it can't be tolerated. Like, any duplication of effort is just so much money wasted, and we shouldn't do it anymore. And actually, I think that duplication of effort has a real role to play. Like, we have to go through that exploratory phase. We have to let multiple versions of a thing appear to really understand what that centralized, consolidated version should look like. We can't just skip to the central version. We have to go through that divergent phase. So I actually, more recently, I wrote an article called In Defense of, I can't remember what I called it. It's something about like, here's why I don't think duplication of effort is a bad thing. So I think it's important to have opportunities for people to share what they're working on, so that hopefully you can pick up some of those areas where it makes sense for people to collaborate. But I also tend to challenge that idea that, like, we need to have a holding zone for people to share, you know, early designs, because God forbid anybody does the same thing in two parts of the organization more than once. Because I kind of think that's actually like a key part of a design system success, is to make that like duplication, multiplication sort of phase part of the process. That makes sense.
Definitely. No, it makes total sense.
Yeah.
Listen, thank you so much
Thank you.
your time, for answering all of our burning questions and sharing your knowledge. It was amazing. Thank you so much.
No
Thank you
problem at
so
all.
much,
Thank you
Amy,
so much.
really, for sharing so much knowledge and your personal story. It was always on my bucket list to ask you if you could speak at our event. So thank you so much. That was a great kickoff of our event here. Thank you.
No, thank
Where
you.
can
Thank you for
folks
having me.
connect with you? You are very active on Twitter, right?
I'm very active on Twitter still, yeah, to a fault. Yes, I'm on Twitter at Amy_Hupe. I'm on Mastodon also. I think I'm on the social.design.systems instance for people that are on Mastodon. And I'm also, my website, amyhupe.co.uk, which I think has been shared in the chat. There's my email and my contact details and stuff on there. So